Hello and welcome to this session on government, cross-sectoral and workplace policies and supports. So this session is part of theme 2 of the Sustainable Care Conference on Work, Care and Wellbeing, New Solutions and Ongoing Challenges. My name is Attracta Lafferty. I'm a research fellow at the School of Nursing, Midwifery and Health Systems at the University College Dublin. I'm a principal investigator for a project called the CareWell Project, which seeks to support family carers to balance work with care, and we place particular emphasis on health and well-being. So I'm delighted to be your chair for this session, and we have 4 presenters today who will present for up to 15 minutes each. And following that, then we will have the discussant's remarks. And then we'll have some time towards the end for some questions and answers. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker. And our first speaker today is Camille Allard. Camille is a PhD student at the Centre for International Research on Care, Labour and Equalities at the University of Sheffield. And Camille is going to present to us today on supporting working carers in the workplace, exploring the link between personal and collective well-being. Thank you, Camille.
So hi everyone, my name is Camille Allard and I'm a PhD student at the University of Sheffield. My PhD is part of the Sustainable Care Programme and focuses on workplace support for working carers. So today I'm going to present you some of my findings. First, I'm going to show you how workplace support contributes to working carers' well-being, and second, explore the link between individual and collective well-being for working carers. So my presentation is divided in 4 parts. On my first part, I'm going to present you what are the different workplace policies which can contribute to better well-being outcome for working carers. In the second part, I'm going to present you how well-being is an important but contested concept and how we can apply it to the workplace policy for working carers. Then I will present you the methodology that I use for my research and some of my key findings. So next slide, please. So working carers, first of all, are individuals combining paid work and unpaid care for a disabled, long-term ill or elderly relative. So in terms of well-being, studies have shown that working carers are more likely to have lower well-being outcome compared to non-carers because they may face higher burden of higher stress, anxiety issue, health issues, lack of time, financial struggle, and difficulty to retain their jobs. So studies have also shown that workplace policies such as care leave, so having time off to provide care, can contribute to better well-being outcome for working carers. However, in the UK, care leave is not a statutory right, so it's not been legislated yet by the UK government. So it's still dependent on willingness to implement it. There are also other forms of existing workplace support, such as flexible policies, a care passport, which is a working pattern agreed between the working carer and his line manager to help him building his working life around his care responsibilities. So how does this policy contribute to the well-being, and what do we mean by well-being? So next slide, please. So one of the aims of the Sustainable Care Programme is to deliver well-being outcome. However, as I was saying earlier, well-being is an important concept, but a contested concept. First, because of its meaning, its application, which remain debated. So it has been at the center of several social care and welfare program reform in the UK, such as the Care Act 2014, which focuses on well-being outcome for carers and the person cared for. But studies are calling into question how we measure well-being and the relevance of using subjective well-being as an indicator in public policies. So it's a large debate, but one of the main criticism against this perception as well-being is individualism, because it tends to focus on people's sense of own satisfaction and happiness and exclude all the contextual, material, structural elements in which people report this sense of well-being. So an interesting model of well-being used by the Sustainable Care Programme for their research is McGregor and Powell 2014 multidimensional model, because it includes different dimensions of well-being. So it also includes material and volitional dimension of well-being. Another part of the interest of this model is how it also emphasizes the importance of collective well-being. So it does not only emphasize on well-being at the individual level, but look at how social groups play a role in allocating resources to individuals, then shaping a better sense of their collective well-being. So now I'm going to try and use this model to look at how the workplace policy of carers are allocated on the workplace. So what is interesting is to look at this different group of actors in the workplace and look at their role in influencing and implementing the policies. So next slide, please. So in terms of methodology, this study utilized a qualitative case studies approach to organization, which have voluntarily implemented some form of support, such as paid care leave, care passport, care network, flexible policies. So these case studies are case studies of large private, public and third sector organizations in the UK. And to be more specific, this organization belonged to an employers forum called Employers for Carers, through which organization can benefit from support from other organizations, but also from this forum, and be able to implement the policies and exchange about good practices. So they're quite exceptional organization because it's not yet common practice for organizations to implement support for working carers. So as part of this, of my research, I done some interviews with HR manager, HR representative, line manager, working carers, union representative, and carers network. I also did some interviews with key informants, so people from other organizations such as diversity and inclusion manager, care network representative. And for this presentation today, I'm going to present you a mix of my qualitative findings, so including finding from these case studies and finding from my interview with key informant. So next slide, please. So what I found from my research in terms of well-being is working carers with support definitely extends that they had a better experience and better well-being outcome. But collective well-being, there is not really a but in terms of collective well-being, there is different factor on which this is dependent. So there is several groups of important in the organization about which I'm going to talk today. Line manager, care network, trade union, and there is different resources between each of those groups, which influence the ability to help working carer to access support. And there are also important factors, such, for example, form of organization of work, which may vary between different business areas in the same organization, and which can lead to conflicting norms, so the policies and the practicalities of applying the policies. So first of all, I'm going to present you my finding about how these workplace policies contribute to better well-being outcome for the individual. So next slide, please. Right, so one finding about this outcome for individual well-being was that having the support from their employers enable working carers to have a better sense of control over the time for caring, also the space for caring. So there was less stress. There were more like fluidity between working and caring. So some of these participants say, for example, one participant say, I think rearranging my working hour has helped me a lot because what happened was quite challenging to do 5 days a week. There wasn't any spare time to do the thing you needed to do in the daytime. Now I've got a better work-life balance because I free up a day to do a lot of things that I would have just eaten into the weekend and destroy family life. Another say, my employer was very good. I managed to use flexi, so hospital appointment and anything like that. I managed to keep through my management of my own day. Having care leave was also a good element for working carer because they didn't have to make up time for the time off they were taking for example, to go to a medical appointment. So, or they didn't have to use their own annual leave to provide care, which was a very big positive progress. So this working carer say, so I just put it in my diary when I need to leave and take my mother to an appointment, and that comes out of the care and compassionate leave as opposed to holiday. So I don't have to make up the time of anything. So that was the finding in terms of individual well-being. Now I'm looking about the role of this different group in the workplace in terms of collecting well-being. So we will first begin with the role of line manager. So next slide, please. Right. So line manager had different experience. Again, it depended in which business area they were working, in the resources they had, and in the nature of their job. So, for example, in the same organization, so these are two quotes from participants from the same organization. So the first line manager said about providing support to her employee. She said, I told my employee, if you do such and such, that's relatively easy. The rest of the other stuff you bring in to me. There is another team. It's me and another team of 5. We can spread the load. And we do that for the next 3 days. I give you some breathing space. Now, I'm not being funny, but that's me being a considerate manager. So this line manager, she had a role more office-based, more in an administrative area of the organization. And she had quite a big team. Well, she had enough staff to help and organize the work, so an employee could take time off without having an impact on the team. Now that was different, for example, from these working carers who was working in the retail area, who say that her line manager was helpful, but was limited in what she could do. So she said, we got market to target to meet, and my line manager got target to meet. Does that make sense? I think she's limited to what she can do, and in all fairness, I've got a job to do, and she expects me to do my job. So in this area, for example, line manager had to find more solution in a kind of ad hoc way, like they had to improvise a lot. So another group which was also of interest was the carers network. So next slide, please. So the carer network were they're important because they enable more visibility for carers in the workplace. They promoted the policy also. And they created a space for carers, for example, to join coffee meetings and connect with each other and share their experience and their tip about working in carers. However, they were also limited in their time and influence because they didn't have enough additional time on top of their day job, so they were a bit constraining in their ability to provide in-depth support for working carers. For example, one participant who was the chair of the care network of one of these organizations said, all I can do is send people to think about the care passport and relevant policy. It's then entirely up to them if they choose to use them, and I've got no way of knowing, and I don't. That's not my business. So they limited they put a limit to the ability to help people because again they had a lack of time about it. Another participant, so this time a key informant, said she could face some issue recruiting people in the care network. So she first said there is a lot of stigma around people disclosing their status as carers. There is a lot of shame around it. So she was still aware that they still had stigmas she had to kind of fight against to help people join the care network and use the policies. She also talked about, again, the different form of work organization, which could also impact people's ability to join the carers network. So she said it is harder for operational staff to have time to participate just because of the nature of the job and the fact that there are very strict starting time, breaking time, and so on. Now we try to decentralize. We try to get our members organize their own meeting network, and we give people who are more remote or work shifts the opportunity to also meet others in similar situations. So on a positive note, there were solution to this issue the chair of the Care Network were facing. They were trying to find a way to delegate responsibility if they didn't have enough time to do it themselves, and which could also help to make sure they had a broader recruitment in the Care Network. So a third group was also the trade union. So next slide, please. So the trade union also played a role in enabling, again, working carer to access support, but they were limited in their power influence. So it depended whether they were recognized by their employers, and even if they were recognized, the care policy was not always part of their bargaining agenda. So that was on the first level. Another level was the fact that there was sometimes a lack of physical presence of union representative. So certain working carer asked them support, for example, to help them writing the application. For example, they could be a good resource, or if they had to make aware the line manager or convince that line manager, having the trade union representative could also be a resource. But because of this lack of physical presence, there was sometimes an obstacle. So, for example, this participant said, our union representative, she's very good, but she's also almost working on her own, and she has got a big area to cover, and I don't like to keep harassing her with the same thing over and over again. Although I do know other people in these buildings that have taken a lot of her time in exactly the same issue. Well, actually, she's the only one trained that can look after our interests in the whole region. On a more positive note, again, there were possibility of collaboration with the Carers Network, and the collaboration with both groups could help reach out more working carers. So, for example, this key informant said, who was the chair of a Carers Network, she said, we would like to move toward working with them, so with the trade union, because they reach into operational part of the business in a much more effective way than us, because they have more members and so on, but they're still a work in progress. So all this group of factors which were important in the workplace, they had, had possibility of interacting and working together or overlapping with each other. So next slide, please. So in conclusion, so when looking at working care support, so the impact of the policies on workplace policies on working carers' well-being, it is useful to examine the individual level, how concretely help working carers, but also if we look at the organizational level, which group shape, enable, facilitate access to resources for working carers. And of course, there is a role of other groups. For example, employers for carers is considered as a group who also contribute to working carers' well-being, because they help the employer implement this support. And we can look also at the role of other groups like the European Union, the UK government, or different group and institutions, which are also responsible to shape this access to resources. So that was my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Camille, for that really interesting presentation, and a really interesting way of looking at well-being, personal, collective well-being. And I think, it just goes to show how many key informants and key stakeholders can play a role in supporting working family carers. You mentioned line managers and HR professionals and working carers themselves and trade unions. So I think, we'll have some really interesting questions later in the question and answer session. Thank you very much, Camilla.
Thank you.
So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our second presenter for this session. So I'm delighted to introduce Professor Janet Fast, who is a professor at the University of Alberta in Canada. And Janet is also a co-investigator on the Sustainable Care Programme. And Janet's going to present to us on sustaining family carers, the case of carers' leave in Canada. Thank you very much, Janet.
Thank you, Attracta. Yes, today I am going to share with you some early findings from a larger project that involves an international comparison of carer leave policy instruments from 10 of the countries that are involved in the Sustainable Care Program. I'm going to focus primarily on the Canadian case today and make some comments at the end about how what's going on in Canada compares to the UK, but the full comparison will be reflected in the book that we're working on as well. Next slide. Carer leaves are intended to address one of the primary challenges that carers report experiencing. We know that, at least in Canada, and I think in most developed countries, the majority of family carers are employed, and most of those are employed full-time. In Canada, it's 75% plus are employed, of those who are employed full-time. We also know that family carers are comprising a larger and larger proportion of the labor force. At this point, about a third of the labor market in Canada, labor force in Canada, are in fact employed carers. We also know that family carers report negative consequences, some of which were alluded to by Camille. We know that being involved in caregiving increases the likelihood of absenteeism, increases the likelihood of carers reducing their hours in order to meet their care demands, and substantial minorities tend to leave the labor force or get fired or retire early in order to provide care, to continue to provide the care that they need to provide. Obviously, employment is important to the carers themselves. It provides them with a way to support themselves financially and their families, provides benefits, and as well as social engagement opportunities. Carers sometimes that their paid work is a form of respite for them, for example. We also know that employed carers contribute to employers' productivity and their profitability, and that the same employment consequences that have implications for carers also have implications, cost implications for employers. Absenteeism, turnover, and reduced hours are all costly to employers as well. Next slide, please. So carer leaves have become a strategy for policymakers to provide an opportunity for an employed carer to take a break from their employment responsibilities temporarily, is the usual intent, in order to deal with their family care demands. Legislated care leaves essentially require employers to grant leaves if an employee meets the eligibility requirements that are specified in the regulations, in the legislation and the attached regulations. One of the things that we've found in our research with employers is that many of them aren't really aware that they have employed carers in their workplaces. They don't see it as a separate issue apart from the challenges that employed parents face, for example. And they don't understand that there are unique needs of family carers apart from those of parents. So in Canada, at least, we've observed that there are very few employers who provide supports specifically to family carers in their workplaces. Next slide, please. Can we have this one full screen? Canada has some unique features that complicate both the study of policies in the country and the making of policy in the country. The map to the left here is a map of Canada, and each of the colored segments represent a different political jurisdiction. So Canada has a federated policy structure or structure. We have a federal government, we have 10 provincial governments, We have 3 territorial governments. Those are the Northern Territories. And then we have municipal governments for each town, municipality, village, city. All of them play a role to some extent, and all of them have been allocated certain jurisdictions by our Constitution. However, the mandates for different levels of government sometimes overlap, and that certainly is the case with respect to the policy domains that are relevant to care leaves. The labor legislation or the labor market is a good example of that, where there's a federal labor code that applies only to the 10% of workers in Canada who are working in federally regulated industries, such as communications and transportation. All of the railways are governed by provincial or territorial labor codes. So one of the results is that there's a lot of overlap among jurisdictions, but also a lot of variability. Next slide, please. So with that backdrop, I'll share with you some of a description of some of the care leave policies in Canada. They break into 2 general types. There are short-term leaves and longer-term leaves. Short-term leave in Canada is typically referred to as family responsibility leaves, and each of the jurisdictions I spoke of has a different length of leave, between 3 and 12 days per year in most jurisdictions. That is kind of between 3 and 5 days. Longer-term leaves include a compassionate care leave, which is intended for people who are providing care to someone who has been declared to be at end of life. And there's a critical illness leave, which is for those who are caring for someone with a critical illness with some chance of death. It's a fine distinction, but they are for different purposes. The compassionate care leave is a maximum of 26 weeks in a 52-week period. And here there is some variability across provinces and territories in terms of the length of the leave, but most of them hover around between 25 and 27 or 28 weeks. Critical illness leaves, there are 2 different critical illness leaves. One if you're caring for a critically ill child, and the other if you're caring for a critically ill adult. The main difference being the length of the leave is longer for those caring for a child than for a critically ill adult. At this point, these leaves are primarily federal, so they apply to workers in those industries that are federally regulated. The provinces have not yet caught up. The compassionate care leave started as a federal program, but all of the provinces and territories have now implemented their version of this. The leaves themselves are not paid, but those who qualify for the leaves also qualify for employment insurance, which provides partial income replacement of around 55%, up to a maximum. Those benefits can be topped up by employers. It's not required, but some employers who wish to retain caregiver employees do top up to 95%, I think is the maximum. Next slide, please. Full-blown evaluations of carer leaves, at least in Canada, are few and far between. And in fact, our international scans suggest the same is true in other countries. Some of those that have been done, again, this is certainly true in Canada, by government departments that are responsible for them, they're not publicly available. The governments have kept them, essentially kept them quiet, I guess. So in order to do our cross-country comparative analysis, we adopted a framework, a set of criteria, evaluation criteria, from a similar study that's been done internationally for a number of years that focuses primarily on childcare issues and parental care issues. The criteria being flexibility, how flexible are the provisions, how equitable are the provisions, to what extent is job security, and what is the situation in terms of income security that may or may not flow from the programs. So if we look at the family responsibility leaves, these are the short leaves of 3 to 12 days per year. We find that these leaves are relatively flexible because the definition of family is very comprehensive and includes a number of kind of families of choice sorts of definitions or individuals. And so it covers not just close family members, but it also includes friends and neighbors and so on who may be involved in a significant way in caring for someone who needs it. They also can be taken in one-day increments in Canada. In other jurisdictions, they can be taken in part-day increments, but in Canada, you can take them one day at a time. They tend to be relatively equitable across jurisdictions. They are available across all jurisdictions, with one exception being the Northwest Territories. However, the length of the leave varies, as I said, quite widely between 3 and 12 days. In terms of job security, the employees are certainly protected in terms of their ability to return to the same or similar job that they had prior to taking the leave. And income security, the income security part of it comes through the EI benefits if they're eligible. For federally regulated employees, the first 3 days are paid. Otherwise, and in most jurisdictions, the leaves are unpaid, and these do not qualify for those EI benefits. Next slide, please. For the longer term leaves, the compassionate and critical leaves, again, the definition of family is quite comprehensive. The leave can be shared among family care network members, which I think is quite unusual and quite progressive. And these leaves can be taken in 1 week increments. Remember that the leaves, compassionate care is 26 weeks, and critical illness leaves between 17 and 37 weeks. So family members can take those in 1 week increments. The compassionate care leave is available in all jurisdictions. Both the federal and provincial labor codes provide this leave. The critical illness leave is available only in some. The federal legislation is in place. Provincial legislation is still catching up. There is some variation in the length of leaves across jurisdictions. There's variation in minimum service requirements. You have to have worked for the same employer for a certain amount of time, and you have to have put in a certain number of work days or hours of work, really, in order to qualify. There are certainly some gender equity concerns that come from the income replacement amounts and from social norms. Again, this leave too protects employees against dismissal, layoff, suspension, demotion, or any other penalties from taking the leave. And again, this set of leaves is, in fact, does make individuals qualified for the EI benefit, and a benefit which has been criticized for the generosity of the benefit, if you will, the value of the benefit, and excuse me. there is, excuse me, there's no compensation in our system for lost pension benefits, which is another outcome for caregivers. Next slide, please. Just in reflecting on the overall picture that's painted by the findings, Canadian carers, I think, are pretty fortunate to have access to a range of care leaves that cover a number of different caregiving situations and demands, protect working carers' jobs, and legislation that also provides income replacement, partial income replacement for some kinds of care leaves. In all cases, the definition of family that's used is very broad, which makes many carers qualified for the leaves. The critical illness leaves have been added more recently than the compassionate care leaves, so has expanded the eligibility for longer leaves beyond those who are caring for someone at end of life. However, they're certainly not perfect. We've observed that take-up rates are relatively low, and that's been attributed to lack of awareness, the need to obtain a medical certificate that declares the care receiver either to be at end of life or to have a life-threatening condition. The income replacement rate, as I said, has been criticized for being low. It's the same program that provides benefits for parents who are on leave, and it has been, as I said, for a number of decades been criticized as being too low. There also are some gaps in eligibility across jurisdictions, and there still are carers whose needs are not being met by these provisions. And none of the programs that we have protect against loss of retirement benefits. In a brief comparison to the UK situation, the UK does not have legislated care leaves, at least the longer term ones. There has been some discussion recently about introducing a 1 week unpaid care leave. But there is a sort of an equivalent to the family responsibility leave. However, in contrast, Canadian carers lack access to a social care system. There is no social care system in Canada. There are programs that provide some components of the UK's social care system. But there is no equivalent, for example, to the UK's right to request the right to have carers' needs assessed and met. So that's kind of a first pass at the care leave assessments. Stay tuned for 8 more countries. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Janet, and thanks for sharing with us the situation in Canada with regards to carers leave and some early kind of comparisons with the UK. I think it'd be really interesting when you do the international comparisons amongst all 10. There's a lot of variability in how in its uptake and its administration implementation. That book I think would be really interesting. So that's great, Janet. Thank you very much for that. So I'm moving on now to our third speaker, and I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague, Ms. Dominique Phillips, who is a research assistant on the CareWell project based at University College Dublin. And Dominique's going to present today on altering work arrangements to accommodate care commitments, family care's experience in the Irish context. Thank you, Dominique.
Thanks, Attracta. So My name is Dominique Phillips. I'm research assistant on the Carewell project in University College Dublin, and it's being conducted in partnership with Family Carers Ireland. The project aims to promote health and self-care among working family carers. It's funded by the Health Research Board in Ireland, and I'd just like to acknowledge the Carewell team who are named here as well. Next slide, please. So a brief overview of my presentation today. So we'll take a look at the background for the research. We'll take a closer look at the Irish policy context, and then the study's aims, method, findings, and the research implications. Next slide, please. So working family carers in Ireland are those who provide care to a family member due to chronic illness, disability, or an age-related dependency, while also in paid employment. And Family Carers Ireland estimate that around 1 in 9 employees in Ireland have family care responsibilities. This research area is really in its infancy in Ireland. However, in their first State of Caring report published last year, Family Carers Ireland found that 55% of the survey's respondents had given up work to provide care, 23% had reduced their working hours, others reported turning down opportunities for training, education, and promotions, and perhaps most notably, only 3% reported that caring had no impact on their ability to work. And these employment impacts of caring have been well documented in the literature internationally. Next slide, please. So just to take a quick look at the Irish policy context. So in Ireland, we have a national care strategy, and in this, carers are formally recognised as key care partners. And one of the objectives in this strategy is to enable carers to remain in touch with the labour market to the greatest extent possible. However, there's been limited progress in terms of the objectives set out in the strategy, and refreshing the strategy is on the current government's agenda. In Ireland, we also have the Carers Leave Act, which entitles employees in Ireland to a job protected leave of up to 2 years to provide care. This leave can be taken in minimum blocks of around 3 months. It's an unpaid leave, but while on leave, carers can apply for state income supports. Another relevant piece of policy is the EU Directive for Work-Life Balance. And this directive sets out new provisions, minimum provisions for EU member states, which includes a minimum of 5 days carers leave per year. And also it will provide carers and parents with the right to request flexible working. This right to request flexible working is something that's not available in Ireland at the moment, and EU member states have until August 2022 to transpose these standards into national law. Next slide, please. So that leads us on to the aim of the current research, which was to explore the experiences of family carers who've had to give up paid work or alter their work arrangements to care for a relative with a disability, chronic illness, or due to old age. Next slide, please. So this study adopted a qualitative design in order to gather rich contextual information about each carer's work, care, and family situations. We conducted 10 semi-structured face-to-face interviews pre-pandemic. These interviews were audio recorded and transcribed verbatim, and then the findings were analysed thematically. Next slide, please. And here's just a quick look at the participant characteristics. So we spoke to 7 women and 3 men. You can see in this map of Ireland where participants were based. Most of them lived in the Dublin area. Participants were providing care to different family members and for different reasons, which you can see listed here. And at the time of the interview, 5 participants were balancing work and care, 4 were caring full-time, and 1 participant was no longer providing care and had returned to work full-time. Next slide, please. And what we found was that the 10 participants had altered their work arrangements in quite a wide range of ways. The most popular being carers leave a career change or a career break. And what we found was that participants used a combination of work alterations throughout their career, and many spoke about the possibility of needing to alter their work arrangements again in the future. Next slide, please. And a thematic analysis of the interview data identified 4 themes, which I'll now talk through in a bit more detail. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the first theme is catalyst for work alteration. And what we found was that a number of factors contributed to carers altering their work arrangements or leaving employment. This included reaching a breaking point or a state of burnout, which was very much connected with the competing demands of work and care, having an inflexible employer or an inflexible workplace culture, increased care needs or the deterioration of a loved one's health, inadequate home care and replacement care, and then key transition points throughout the caring role, such as the birth of a family member, diagnosis, starting primary school, secondary school, or transitioning to adult services. Next slide, please. So as one participant describes here, well, my preference would have been to stay working part-time, but my company wouldn't even consider it. So my hand was very much forced. It was, you know, come back full-time, which it wasn't even something I didn't want to do. I could not do. So this quote really illustrates the factor that inflexible culture played in this carer's decision to leave employment. This carer decided to take voluntary redundancy because she wasn't facilitated in work. Next slide, please. So then the second theme was the value that carers placed on work. And the majority of people we spoke to expressed a preference to remain in employment if possible. And being in employment was very much associated with a sense of personal identity, respite, or social outlet. It was, of course, an important source of income. However, what we found was that ultimately the caring role took precedence, and carers put the needs of their family above their desire or need to remain in employment. Next slide, please. So as one participant describes here, I was losing my identity. I was just my daughter's carer, and that became a massive thing. I wasn't me anymore. I wasn't the healthcare professional anymore. And actually, I missed trying to help people, and I missed being good at something. So I went back to work after the year. And this was a carer who had taken carer's leave. And you can really see that sense of feeling qualified and good at something versus how she felt in her caring role at that time. Next slide, please. The third theme is compromises for care. And we saw among the interviewed participants that they had made a number of sacrifices across different life domains in order to fulfill their caring role. This was seen in terms of career development, with many people describing taking lower grades than what they were qualified for in work. There was also this way up between flexibility and salary, with many carers compromising on earnings. Other participants spoke about missing major life events or milestones, such as buying a house. There was also a perceived loss of status associated with altering work arrangements or leaving employment. And then finally, other participants described difficulties transitioning back to employment. Next slide, please. So in the second quote here, you can see an example of those difficulties when transitioning back to work. So I went back to work and they gave him my replacement, my office. And I mean, look, that's a message. So I had a huge status drop. That was not my choice really to leave. I only left because I absolutely couldn't stay. So that was very unfair actually. And you can really get a sense of this person's frustration in this situation at work. This carer was someone who took a career break to to provide care. Next slide, please. So then the final theme is employment strategies adopted by carers in order to fulfill their caring role. And what we found was that there was a real mismatch between what was offered by their employers and what the actual needs of carers were. And in lieu of this right support, carers had to strategically and actively carve out a care-friendly career. And they did this by retraining or returning to education or gaining further qualifications in order to find a role that was flexible and accommodated their care commitments. Other strategies included re-employment or a career change. Other participants spoke about adopting strategies like remote working and rearranging their work days and hours. There was also a need to establish rapport and communicate their care commitments to their colleagues, their employers, and also potential employers. And in the case of two participants, age was a factor in their decision, and they felt that retirement was their only option in order to be able to continue to provide care. Next slide, please. So you can see in the first quote here, it took me actually breaking down in the office and one day and saying, this is what's happening. I have to get up in the morning and watch my daughter have tremors before breakfast. And that's on a normal morning. That's not when there's seizure-related activity, you know. I think for people and for managers in particular, it's not knowing about that day-to-day reality, because you wouldn't know it unless you lived it. And this carer was reluctant to disclose her care commitments in work. However, it was the only way that she actually gained that empathy and understanding that she was seeking in work. Next slide, please. So there are a number of implications based on our findings. So firstly, the need for increased awareness and recognition of the role of family carers, both within workplaces, but also at a much broader societal level. Our findings suggest that there's a need for carer-centred policy. And we saw this in terms of that mismatch between what employers were offering and what the needs of carers were. Our findings also suggest that policy matters, that the Carers Leave Act in Ireland is currently a key mechanism that enables people to balance work and care. However, a much broader range of supports and entitles are needed. And then also the need to reduce the financial burden and responsibility on carers. And we really saw that responsibility on carers to find their own sustainable ways of working and caring. Next slide, please. And just a few further considerations. So the implementation of the EU Directive for Work-Life Balance is a huge opportunity in Ireland, and just, I suppose, to ensure that this is implemented in a way that best supports working family carers. Our findings also suggested that there is a need to support carers who wish to re-enter employment after a period of caring. And then finally, these interviews were conducted before the COVID-19 pandemic, so the long-term impacts of the pandemic on working family carers also needs consideration. However, our findings certainly indicated that the reconciliation of work and care was possible with the right supports. And I would just like to leave you with one quote from one of the participants. Next slide, please. I think most carers in my position do have to give up work. And I think the only reason I've been able to continue on is because I've got the supports that I have. And those supports are very simple when you look at them. They're flexible working hours, empathy and awareness, trust, consideration, and a parking permit. That's all they are. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic, for the presentation. I love that last quote, and it just goes to show sometimes it's just a simple solution, and even just a work parking permit could make to rush off to care for their daughter. And also it's great to keep working carers' voices at the forefront there. We've got an insight into the scenarios, predicaments that carers find themselves in, and they have to make decisions about work and care and what alterations they need to make. So I thought that's really interesting. Thank you, Dominic, for that. Okay, so just move on to our fourth and final speaker for this session. I'd like to introduce Professor Jason Hayes. Jason is a Professor of Employment Relations in the School of Management at the University of Sheffield, and Jason is going to present to us on employer support for working carers and its consequences for employees' wellbeing in England and Wales. Over to you, Jason. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So yes, this paper is going to look at employer support for working carers and look at the implications for employees' wellbeing, and it's focused on England and Wales. It's based on a nationally representative survey. It's linked to the Sustainable Care Work Package that Janet and I co-lead, which is looking at employer support for working carers. And just before we start, I'd like to acknowledge our colleague Annie Austin, who was very heavily involved in this aspect of the research and co-authored the report that provides the basis for the research findings I'm going to present today. Okay, next slide, please. So just by way of a brief introduction, the paper looks at the ability of working carers in England and Wales to combine caring responsibilities with paid employment and the difference that employer support makes in that regard. We know that the adequacy of employer support for working carers is a matter of increasing concern in terms of the labour market, in terms of labour market policy and social protection. The number of working age people who have caring responsibilities has grown rapidly and will grow further in the future. So it's a current policy concern. It's going to be an even greater policy concern in the future. A recent estimate suggests there are around 4.87 million working carers in the UK. That's based on Carers UK research. I think that's the most recent estimate. That's a substantial proportion of the workforce, clearly. And as has already been alluded to by the other speakers, working carers face a great number of challenges, such as those workers who leave their jobs to provide care and no longer have income from employment. Households then experience a substantial financial hit. The physical and mental health and overall well-being of carers can suffer, as was very clearly shown in the previous presentation. And there are also implications for employers too, because employers may lose experienced staff due to people leaving because of their caring roles. They may see an increase in unscheduled absences, or workers may be so tired or pressured that they cannot concentrate at work, and that has implications, of course, for their productivity and the quality of the work that they perform. Next slide, please. So the findings themselves are based on data from a representative survey of employees with care responsibilities in England and Wales. We believe this is the first representative survey of employees in those countries. So hopefully it provides an accurate picture of the problems that working carers experience and also the benefits that employer support can provide. The survey questionnaire was designed by researchers at University of Sheffield, but also more broadly the Sustainable Care team, Carers UK. Janet also contributed to the creation of the survey questionnaire. Katherine Wilson had a hand in it. So it was a team effort by the Sustainable Care Programme. The survey itself was financially supported by the CIPD, Chartered Institute for Personnel and Development, who commissioned YouGov, the public opinion and data company, to administer the survey. The achieved sample size was 970 unpaid carers in employment. It was slightly more than that, but once we'd excluded the self-employed, the achieved sample size was 970. We were only looking at employees. We weren't including the self-employed in the analysis. Survey was carried out online in July and August 2019, and the survey sample was weighted to be representative of all unpaid carers aged 18 years and over in employment in England and Wales. In the report itself, we provided some estimates of the total number of workers who are affected. We've tried to scale up the numbers so they reflect the overall population of employees who are also carers in England and Wales. Not going to talk about that too much in this paper, but that information is available in the report, which is published and is available on the CIPD's website. Next slide, please. I'll start with some basic descriptive statistics relating to the composition of the sample. So 56% of the working carers in the sample were women. Almost half of them were between 35 and 54 years of age, but a substantial number, just over a third, are younger people below the age of 35. So that suggests that many people at all career stages need to combine work and care. We need to look at solutions that work for younger and older employees. Of the working carers, 84% were in permanent contracts and 72% work full-time. So these are people who are working full-time that then have caring responsibilities that are additional to the full-time work that they perform. And we estimate that to equate to around 2.6 million working carers in the UK. So, sorry, not in the UK, in England and Wales. So it's not an insignificant number. 44% of all working carers say that they find it difficult to combine their paid employment and their caring responsibilities, and we estimate that equates to around 1.6 million carers in England and Wales, 1.6 million people who are struggling to juggle their employment and their care responsibilities. Next slide, please. There are impacts on work and from people undertaking care responsibilities, and there are impacts on care from people undertaking paid employment. So we've looked at some of the challenges that people face in terms of the impact of care on the work people perform, their paid employment, not unpaid work, but paid work. Most working carers had experienced difficulty in concentrating at work because of their caring responsibilities. Many had considered reducing their hours, and a quarter had considered quitting their jobs altogether because of their caring responsibilities. Even where they stay in employment, there may be negative implications for their career progression. We found that 36% of working carers had turned down a job offer or a promotion offer over the past 12 months, or decided not to apply for a job because of their caring responsibilities. With regard to the impact of paid work on care, we asked working carers whether and how often they'd come home from work in the past 12 months feeling too tired to perform some of their caring responsibilities. This was widely experienced. 28% said they'd felt that way at least once a week. For 13% of working carers, it was a daily experience coming home from work just too tired to perform some of their caring responsibilities. Next slide, please. Working carers took it upon themselves to find ways of reconciling the competing demands on their time, or at least attempting to reconcile those things. They had various coping strategies. So 30% of working carers had sought to achieve a better balance between their paid work and caring responsibilities by reducing their hours of work. For men, that was typically reducing overtime rather than contractual hours. For women, it was more likely that they would be reducing their contractual hours rather than overtime, but there was a mix. 36% of women had cut their hours compared to 24% of men. In addition, looking at the sample as a whole, almost half of working carers, 46%, had used their own annual leave to provide care. 24% had worked evenings to make up time spent caring. 23% had worked weekends to make up time spent caring, and 15% had taken sick leave in order to provide care. Next slide, please. So, in terms of employer support for caring, the first thing to note really is that a third of working carers are employed in workplaces that provide absolutely no support for working carers. Only 40% of all working carers regard their employer as being carer friendly, and a similar proportion believe that their employer supports them when care responsibilities compete with their paid work responsibilities. In terms of the forms of support that are available to workers, the most common forms of support are not those that are specifically directed at supporting working carers, but are forms of support or forms of working time reduction or working time flexibility that are available to employees overall, things such as flexi time. Flexi time indeed was the most frequently mentioned resource or form of support, followed by the ability to work at home on some days. Very clear that working from home and flexi time and the other forms of support that are shown in the figure, so that's use of a telephone or private time to make or receive calls, option to work part-time if required, and unpaid leave for carers, which was available to about 11% of working carers. All of those things do make a difference to the ability of working carers to combine their work and caring responsibilities. So the blue bar there shows where working carers have said they've accessed these forms of support and that it's made it easier for them to carry out their caring roles while still doing their work. And you can see that ability to work from home, flexi time, use of telephone, option to work part-time, unpaid leave for carers, these are all having substantial benefits on the lives of working carers. Next slide, please. So we looked at the benefits, or whether there are any benefits to working carers from having these forms of support. And the way we did this was by using the well-known WHO5 measure of well-being, which asks respondents to respond to 5 statements and indicate to what extent they felt they felt cheerful and in good spirits over the last 2 weeks. They felt calm and relaxed over the previous 2 weeks. They felt active and vigorous, woke up feeling fresh and rested. Woke up feeling fresh and rested, and that their daily life has been filled with things that interest them. And so respondents respond to these statements, either stating they felt that way all the time, most of the time, more than half of the time, less than half of the time, some of the time, at no time, or they don't know. So we asked the participants in our survey to respond to those statements, and then we transformed their responses into a linear variable, which scored 0 to 100, and then we categorized the participants, the respondents, into 4 groups according to the quartile of the scale in which they fell. So low well-being, medium to low well-being, medium-high well-being, and high well-being. Next slide, please. And so what I hope you can see here is, well, first of all, we've summed together low and medium low to create just a measure for net low, which is shown on the right hand side of the figure. And we've done the same for medium high and high to create a measure for net high. And you can see, if we look at net low, 60% of working carers reported low or medium low mental well-being. And a significantly smaller proportion, 38%, fell into the high or medium high categories. Overall mental well-being is higher among working carers and organisations that provide support than among those that provide no support. We found a very clear association here. So 43% of working carers employed by organisations that provide some sort of support to working carers report high or medium high well-being, compared to only 30% in organisations that provide no support. Low or medium low mental well-being was significantly more likely among working carers employed in organisations that provided no support, 70%, compared to those that provided support, 57%. And if we go to the next slide, we can see this a little bit more clearly. So we have the 4 bars on the left there, that's employer providing support, and you can see that as we go across, we've got low mental well-being, medium low mental well-being, medium high, and high mental well-being. The right-hand side, the 4 bars on the right-hand side, those are for situations where working carers are provided with no support by their employer. You can see that the gradient is steeper here. You can see that if we look at the particularly the high mental well-being, the proportion of workers who report high mental well-being is much smaller in organisations that provide no support than in organisations that do provide support. We suspect the employer-provided support is compensating for the factors in the lives of working carers that might harm their mental well-being. There's a positive compensatory effect evident across all levels of well-being, but the largest difference are among those with the lowest mental well-being. So you can see that in relation to those working carers and organisations that have no support, you can see how much much more significant is the problem of low or medium-low mental well-being for those working carers. Next slide, please. There are also benefits to employers which are worth mentioning as well. This is not just beneficial to employees. These forms of support are not just beneficial to employees, but they're also beneficial to employers. There is a business case here. So working carers who felt supported by their employer were less likely to have considered reducing their hours, giving up their jobs completely. They were less likely to find it difficult to concentrate at work, less likely to have turned down a promotion opportunity or decided against applying for a job, and they were less likely to have taken sick leave. If we look at the next slide, please, I won't go through all the figures. Thank you. Yeah, I won't go through all the figures, but what this shows is if we look at the yeses, these are workers in organisations that do provide support. The no's are workers in organisations that do not provide support. And for the most case, what you can see is, and we've measured this using chi-square tests for those who are interested in that sort of thing, we do find significant differences in responses to these different statements, categories. So workers who feel supported were less likely to consider quitting their job. They're less likely to find it hard to concentrate at work, less likely to turn down a promotion, they're less likely to take sick leave. The only discrepancy here is the first category, where you see that workers who feel supported are a slightly larger percentage of those workers were saying they were considering reducing their hours. But if we look at those who say they definitely were not, you also see that percentage is also larger. What we've done here is we've taken out those workers who said that they were uncertain about whether they were going to do these things, or workers who said they neither agreed nor disagreed with the statements. So overall, positive evidence for substantial benefits to employers there. So by way of conclusion, next slide and final slide, please. There's a significant gap in employer support for working carers in England and Wales. Only 1/3 of working carers believe their employer provides them with, 1/3 of working carers believe that their employer provides them with no support of any kind. Only 2/5 of working carers believe their employer is carer friendly. Efforts to combine work and care can result in stress, anxiety and low well-being, and affect the ability of working carers to perform well in their jobs. Employer-provided support for working carers is vital in addressing these problems. Working carers who are supported by their employers are more easily able to combine paid employment with unpaid caring responsibilities, resulting in positive impacts on their work, care and well-being. And we've also shown that employers benefit in numerous ways. And that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you for all the facts and figures behind it all. It's quite impressive that the representative survey. I know it's very difficult to achieve that. So, yeah, I think there's some really interesting findings there, both from the employers and from the employees end of things. So that concludes, thank you, Jason. That concludes all 4 presentations then for this session, but I'm going to now invite the discussant for her remarks. And so I have the delight to introduce Miss Katherine Wilson. And Katherine is Head of Employers for Carers at Carers UK. So Katherine, if you want to go ahead and share your remarks from the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm really delighted to be here today. So just to help set the context, I'm just going to highlight some key themes that have come out of the 4 excellent presentations that we've heard, along with some overarching questions that I hope will promote some discussion. So just firstly to recap, we first heard from Camille, who gave us some really interesting insights into the links between the personal and collective well-being of carers in the workplace. And I think some key issues raised by Camille for me were the different aspects of well-being and the need to distinguish between personal and collective well-being, and how individuals and groups in the workplace can shape both the identity of carers and the development of resources to provide support. How collective well-being particularly relies on factors such as forms of organisation of work and different groups of influence, such as line managers, carers, networks and trade unions. And I think lastly that a dynamic carer community in the workplace is important, but that there are, however, different unequal power resources for each of these groups of influence, which is quite a challenge. And I think Camille's 2 questions that she asked us to sort of explore further really were firstly, which groups shape collective well-being by facilitating access to resources for carers in different work settings? So what the different work settings, how they can impact on carer support. And secondly, what is the role that other groups and institutions, for example, governments or civil society, might play in shaping collective well-being and allocating resources? So I think lots of really interesting underlying questions there. And then our second presenter, Janet Fast, provided a really fascinating exploration of the introduction of legislated leave for carers in different countries. And some of the key things I took from Janet's presentation include that there's firstly a clear case for introducing support such as leave to address the negative consequences of caring in the workplace, which are negative both for carers and employers. That there are some common features relating to legislated leave. For example, the purpose of leave in allowing a carer to step away from work responsibilities temporarily to care, and the inclusion of specific eligibility criteria that employees must meet. However, there is a great deal of variability across jurisdictions as to whether leave is provided and to what extent, under what conditions and to what effect. And there's also added complexity in federations like Canada, which, as Janet was explaining, have different levels of government with jurisdiction over different policy domains. And there's also so many variations in the types of leave offered as well. For example, we heard in Canada that short-term leaving is covered by short-term caring is covered by family responsibility leave and longer-term caring by other forms of leave. And some leave is also for specific caring situations, for example, compassionate care leave, which covers end-of-life care. So the language here is really important and can be quite confusing in the workplace. And finally, there's lots of variations in payment and funding, including whether leave is paid or unpaid and how it is funded. And I think 2 further key issues which were really food for thought in Janet's presentation included about firstly measuring the adequacy of leave policies and programmes by using key criteria. So I was struck by the 4 criteria that Janet covered there of flexibility, equity, job security and income security. And then secondly, the persistent barriers around awareness and identification of carers in the workplace. So even where clear eligibility criteria and definitions may exist, many employers are still unaware that they have carers in their organisation or don't understand their unique needs. So in practice, many employers are still not providing support to carers, which is a real challenge. Then our third presenter, Dominique Phillips, provided some really interesting insights from her research on the experiences of family carers who have had to give up paid work or alter their work arrangements to care. I think particularly interesting for me were the key findings from Dominique's thematic analysis under the 4 headings of catalyst for work alteration and the value placed on work, compromises that carers made for care, and employment strategies. These were really interesting, sort of explaining the range of decisions and factors that can really influence why carers make the alterations that they do. So I think that was really food for thought. And some of the other key issues that she raised that I thought were really interesting was the whole range of different types of work alterations that carers often need to make, ranging from maybe just altering some working hours or days to changing their job, taking on a less demanding role, or perhaps moving to a more family-friendly employer or leaving the workforce altogether. So a whole spectrum there. And I think also the multifaceted consequences of these decisions, which can be for families, employers, and the wider economy. She touched on a really interesting point that the availability of workplace support for carers varies greatly and may depend on factors such as company size, sector, location, and gender of employees. And also that in terms of legislative support, although the Irish Carers Leave Act is relatively progressive compared to other international policy, it doesn't currently facilitate the flexible, short-term and paid leave options that carers may need. And she also left us with some key questions as well about whether there is a greater need for a wider range of supports and entitlements for carers, and perhaps looking at the Carers Leave Act 2001 as a key mechanism. And of course, bigger questions as well around the implementation of the EU Directive for Work-Life Balance, the issues about supporting carers who wish to re-enter employment after caring, and also the longer term impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course is something which is very much in all of our minds. And then last, but very much not least, our final presenter, Jason Hayes, gave us some really interesting insights on the state of current employer support for working carers in England and Wales and their consequences for employee wellbeing. I was particularly struck by the findings from the recent survey he mentioned of 1,000 working carers, showing this really significant gap in employer support for working carers, with 1/3 of respondents saying their employer provided no support for carers at all. That was really striking. I think also that the range of impacts of care on work, it's so wide-ranging. It can be from something like difficulty in concentrating at work right the way through to turning down promotion or not applying for a job to actually leaving the workforce. The other thing that really struck me was that although the most frequently mentioned forms of support were, as Jason said, flexi-time, the ability to work at home on some days, the most highly reported coping strategy from carers from the survey was using annual leave to care. So that was quite interesting. And I think both Jason and Dominique talked about the sort of mismatch sometimes between employer provision and what carers really need. And the fact that using annual leave to care was the sort of highestly reported coping strategy was very interesting. And that it was followed by reducing working hours or working evenings or weekends to make up time or taking sick leave to care, but that the annual leave to care was such an important way that carers were obviously needing to take leave. And obviously the findings on mental health were really interesting, with 60% of working carers reporting this to be low or medium to low. Perhaps unsurprisingly, that overall mental well-being was higher among working carers in organisations that provide support than those that provide none. But it's so great to have this direct link and clear association in this research, which really joins those two issues together. So I think just really to recap, there's some really, really interesting issues that have arisen from all of these presentations. And if I can sort of just highlight three sort of key issues which emerged from me almost from all of them. Well, firstly, that there's a clear, close interrelationship between both work and caring situations on carer health and well-being. But how much does carer wellbeing really depend on the carer's type of job role, status in the organisation, or indeed the company size or sector? What are those variations? I think secondly, that although flexible working arrangements are clearly essential and very much the thing that employers mention that they do, and very much the thing that carers also say really helps, but clearly a much wider range of supports and entitlements are needed to enable people to work and care healthily and productively. So how much is there a mismatch between what employers usually offer and what more might be needed by carers? And I think thirdly, particularly something that came out in Janet's presentation, was how we measure adequacy about what is provided, what works. So the criteria that Janet covered around leave provision, but they could also be applied to other forms of support as well, as a really good way of measuring what is working in different countries or across different organisations. So I'm going to leave it at that, because I think we've had a real wealth of information from our 4 excellent presenters. And I think it's now the right moment to hand back to our chair to introduce the final Q&A discussion. And I'm looking forward very much to hearing that. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. That was a great overview of all the different speakers and the different themes. You really highlighted a few key themes and issues there that really sort of summarises the 4 presentations there. So I think that was excellent job. Thank you, Catherine. So this just leaves us now to move on to the last part of the session, which is the question and answer session. So at this point, I think we'll ask all speakers to come back and is to take each presenter and ask 1 or 2 questions each in turn, and then open it to everyone who wants to ask any other questions then after that. So I might start with Camille, if that's okay, Camille, as the first speaker. And I'm going to ask Catherine, if you don't mind, because I know you had a couple of questions there for Camille, if you wouldn't mind kicking off the question and answer session and ask Camille her first question, please.
Thank you very much. So I was really interested, Camille. I thought your presentation was excellent. So I think I was really taken by one of the issues that you were exploring there about, I think, the different work settings. So I was interested in which groups sort of shape the collective wellbeing by facilitating access to resources and support for carers in different work settings. Whether you've got any thoughts on some of the emerging findings from your research there.
Thank you, Catherine, for your question. Well, I think what I try to highlight in the presentation is that when interviewing participants inside the organization, it really depends of, for example, the dynamic in the organization, how, for example, 2 different business areas were communicating, if the carers network, for example, was communicating with the line manager or providing training to line manager. So it's more like there is all this kind of group, if you want, all influence the policy and all, had an influence on how working carers were being made aware of the policies. So yeah, that was more about how they all interconnected, if that makes sense.
Have you any more questions, Catherine, or will I open it up to the others for any questions for Camille?
No, that was very helpful. Thank you, Camille. Nothing more from me immediately.
Thanks, Catherine. Have any other speakers have any questions for Camille? No? Camille, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I was interested, you mentioned all the different levels, as I said already, as stakeholders, be it working carers, line managers, HR professionals, trade unions. And I'm just wondering what role colleagues play in the whole system of collective well-being. Sometimes colleagues can begrudge a person if they're getting special treatment, that they're allowed to leave early to go collect their mother from a daycare centre or anything like that. So I'm just wondering, in your research, had you considered, either speaking to colleagues, or had that come up at the workplace?
Yes, thank you for your question. That's a really good question. And I think an issue about the stigma that working carers sometimes face in the workplace, and which can be an obstacle for them to come forward and ask support. So if, for example, they were able to exchange with colleagues who had the same kind of experience, for example, they were more likely to be confident. So if they knew that they had colleagues or senior colleagues, even more, who had already used a care leave or used a care passport and were on different working arrangements, that really helped them going forward and feel less stigmatized or feel less reluctant to ask for support.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so sometimes they can get support from their colleagues as well if they disclose that they're a carer at home. Okay, thanks, Camille. I'll move along to the different speakers, and if we have time, we'll come back to the group as a whole. So our next speaker then was Janet. So again, Catherine, can I invite you to kick off the questions for Janet, please?
Oh, thank you. I found your paper really interesting, Janet, fascinating, particularly hearing about the complexity of federations like Canada with those challenges. So I was going to ask you about whether you had any comments on the sort of, I suppose, the challenges between the language of what different sorts of leave is called, because obviously some leave can be for a very specific purpose, like compassionate care leave, and that's really useful. But then if you have different sorts of leave called different things, does that sort of dilute the sort of powerful message in the workplace that if you're a carer, you can have leave, if you see what I mean?
I'm not sure whether it dilutes it, but it certainly does confuse it. Even we had some challenges sorting out compassionate care leave from the critical illness leave. And I would imagine that employees have a very similar difficulty sorting it all out. And the eligibility requirements and the provisions, the exact provisions and benefits are very similar, but they're not exactly the same. So that creates another level of confusion. The fact that that the compassionate care leave is now available pretty much across the country, but the critical illness leave is not, again, another level of confusion. So employees and employed carers in particular can be forgiven for being confused. And I think that it does account to some extent for the relatively low take-up rates for those programs, in addition to the lack of awareness and frankly, the difficulty meeting some of the eligibility requirements, which I should add, by the way, some of those eligibility requirements have been relaxed for the COVID lockdown situation. So.
Thank you, Janet. That's really interesting to hear that. In fact, you preempted my other question, which was going to be around COVID and the impact of that, but you've actually answered that one, because that was one I was going to ask. So thank you for that.
Yeah, they've done things like reduce the qualifying period, and I think that's the main one, is reducing the qualifying period. I don't think that they've made any changes to benefits or any of those sorts of things, but they've made it easier essentially for people to qualify for the leave.
That's interesting. Thank you.
Any other questions for Janet?
I have a question, Janet. So there's quite a range of leave entitlements in Canada, and you mentioned a lack of awareness amongst employees. And I'm just wondering if employers or managers, if you're aware of any training in the area of leave entitlement at an employer level.
No, that's a really good question. And one of the things that I know that Carers UK does, and they do very well, is to do that education, is trying to make employers and make carers aware of benefits that they're entitled to. That hasn't happened very readily in Canada. The carer organizations do have information about these leaves on their websites and those sorts of things, but there hasn't been anything very, what I would call, proactive. When the leaves are first introduced, there's a bit of a flurry of activity around, announcements and those sorts of things. But the cynic in me says that that's really about governments trying to make themselves look good than it is about making sure that people are aware. So the short answer to your question, I think, is no. There's not been, I don't think, a concerted effort to really make carers aware of what their entitlements are.
Thanks, Janet. It's a similar situation in the Irish context as well, I would say.
It's disappointing, really, that, for example, trade unions have not really gotten involved in building that awareness either. And neither have levels of awareness and knowledge among employee assistance program employees and managers really aren't very high either. So a lot of employers, we did a survey of employers as well as employees, caregiver employees a few years ago. And one of the things that we found was that employers were not, they to the extent that they were even aware that of the needs of working carers, they believed that if they had an employee assistance firm, if they had a contract with an employee assistance firm, that they should be dealing with it. But the awareness among that group is not very high either. And they believe that if they had a flexible work arrangement policy internally, that also would be sufficient. So that's the kind of lack of awareness that we're dealing with, not just among employed caregivers, but their employers and benefit providers as well.
Thank you, Janet. I'd say that's pretty common across the board, as Dominic mentioned. And moving on then to Dominic, because I'm aware of time. Katherine, would you like to give your first question to Dominic, please?
Thanks very much. Yes, I was really interested to hear your presentation, Dominic. It was fascinating. Just got a question about some of the themes that came out of your analysis, your thematic analysis. So I was really interested in some of these triggers for work alteration. And when you talked about the value placed on work, so things like the sense of identity that work can give, but also the issue about care taking precedence sometimes, if you're in that situation, your loved one will come first. So I just wondered if you had any other sort of reflections or anything further about that sort of, I suppose, potential conflict there between the importance of the identity of work being, very strong for people very often, but then when it comes to it, the care taking precedent is a very human thing that's going to take precedence when you've got a decision around staying in work or caring.
Thank you, Katherine. So the value, the theme you spoke about there, the value placed on work, this is something that we can all relate to. But in the case of the carers we spoke to, when they were lacking perhaps other forms of social outlet, there was I suppose almost an increased value on the role that work played in their lives. Coming to that question about the conflict between that choice to remain in employment and to care for a loved one, I don't really think it was seen as a choice. It was, I suppose, a very natural or human response to the needs of someone's family. However, there was a sense of, I suppose, frustration in some of the interviews that, particularly at a government level, that they almost take advantage of the fact that you will be there for your family. I'm not sure, Attractive, if you've anything else to add. I know you're familiar with the interview data as well.
Oh, yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. People are torn, and at the end of the day, they will turn to their loved one, and that care will come first, and their work will be the one that's sacrificed. And how fair is that to carers, and government know that, and that's exploiting the situation. I think you're right there, Dominic.
Yeah, it's very interesting questions you raise there, though. If only we could all have a really informed and supported choice and the ability to make a real choice. So it's a challenging issue. Thank you for that.
Anyone else, any questions for Dominique?
I had a question for Dominique about the EU directive. If you know what was going to be the impact on Ireland and whether they were going to revise the Carers Leave Act, if there were any consultation about that.
That's a really good question. So we know in Ireland that the uptake of carers leave, similar to the Canadian context, is low. It's an area that warrants a lot more research. So we're unsure whether uptake is low due to lack of awareness or because the provisions don't meet the needs of carers in Ireland. There's some discussion around the implementation of the EU directive. However, I haven't heard the discussion of how carers leave fits into those new provisions. It's something that myself and Attracta have discussed, but I haven't seen it being discussed at a wider level in Ireland. Yeah, so it's I would view the availability of carers leave as an important component in a package of supportive policies, and hopefully the implementation of the EU directive will add to that range of supports that hopefully will be available to working carers in Ireland.
Thank you.
That's perfect. Thank you, Dominique. And we will just move on then to our questions for our last speaker then. And again, over to you, Katherine, if you want to put a question to Jason, please.
Thanks very much. So that was really fascinating too, Jason, your presentation. And so I had a question about one of the key sort of questions you raised in your research, and that was around your thoughts about factors such as occupation, status, or organisation of work influencing carers, employees' ability to access sort of workplace support. It's one of the questions that I know you raised, and it would just be interesting to have your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Katherine. Well, I suppose two quick thoughts on that. First of all, we do actually have some variables in the survey that looked at the organisation of work and the ability of workers to control how their work is organised. And actually, we've not really probably looked into those variables sufficiently so far. I mean, there's kind of data that's under analysed. So I think we need to look at that a little bit more. I mean, in terms of sector and occupation. So in terms of sector, we found surprisingly that actually workers employed in the private sector found it easier than workers employed in the public sector to combine work and care, which was not what we were expecting. We think this might be something to do with the gender composition of the private and the public sectors, and the fact that women in the public sector were overrepresented relative to men when you compare it with the private sector, where there were relatively more men. So we think there's some sort of gender dynamic going on there, with women bearing more responsibility for care, as we know, and that's possibly coming out as a sectoral effect, which actually isn't a sectoral effect. So we need to pin that down a little bit more. It's probably a gender effect rather than a sectoral effect, but we're not entirely sure. We need to pin that down a bit more, I think. And in terms of occupation or status, certainly workers in higher paid occupations, professional occupations, those with managerial or technical or other professional responsibilities, find it easier to combine work and care. They have more access to care leave opportunities. I suppose the fact that they are more highly paid also makes it more possible for them to take unpaid leave if necessary as well. So yeah, there's definitely a difference here in terms of status and occupation and level in the hierarchy and how much you are paid.
Very interesting to hear that. Thank you, Jason. Very interesting. The first response you made there about the sectoral and potential gender issues as well. That would be a really interesting one to explore further, I think.
Absolutely. No, thanks, Katherine. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. Any other questions for Jason from the other speakers? I had a question for you, Jason, that I'd be keen to hear your response. And that's, I understand the data was collected in 2019. So I was wondering, have you any plans in the next year or two to maybe repeat the survey post the pandemic? And what differences do you think would you find if you ran the survey again now?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, the answer to the first question is easy, because no, we don't have any plans to repeat it, and we don't have any resource to repeat it. Although it'd be great to repeat it. I mean, that would be a wonderful thing to do. I think that's a super idea, but unfortunately, within the context of the program, we're not able to do that. I imagine what would we find? Well, I guess the problem of sandwich caring, which we also do have some data about, but that's also something else that we need to look at a little bit more. I think that issue of sandwich caring will probably be even worse than it was before the COVID pandemic struck. I mean, undoubtedly it would be worse. Children off school, working carers still have their other care responsibilities to take care of. So that's certainly something that would be a lot worse. I imagine the wellbeing measures would be negatively affected as well. People will undoubtedly be more stressed. Well, we know they are, don't we? I mean, we know everyone's more pressured just in general. So the impact of that on working carers who are already stressed and finding it difficult to cope will be further magnified too. So conditions obviously will have got worse, despite the fact people are working at home. But that's not, well, not everyone's working at home, but a lot of people are working at home during the lockdowns. But of course, that's not always the panacea. That's cracked up to be either. As we know, working at home can be a path to work intensification and an extension of the working day, which is also problematic. So I would imagine mostly bleak things will have happened.
Yes, I think it certainly would be interesting to have the comparison from pre-COVID and post-COVID, but maybe look out for further funding for that. So I'm just conscious of time. So has anyone got any last comments, general comments, burning questions before we start wrapping up?
On what you've said there, Jason, a question about, I think what will be really interesting to see is where there are examples where employers have perhaps increased provision. And as Janet, you were mentioning earlier about sort of being flexible around widening definitions, etc., about how far these might be things that employers then sort of put into effect for the long term, you know, not just for COVID. So when we come out of the pandemic, whenever we do, you know, can we just hope that some of this good practice will become embedded and become more permanent? So that will be, I think, an interesting question, whether people will just think, right, we're out of COVID-19 now and go back to our earlier provision. I don't know if anyone's got any comments on that. It's a question, really, just no one can really answer, I think, but just to think it'll be an interesting one to keep under review.
I tend to be a bit of a cynic about these things, and my cynical view is that we'll probably revert to type when we're done with the COVID restrictions. My guess would be that the Canadian government certainly will go back, especially with respect to the EI benefits. They'll probably go back to the qualifying period requirements and the waiting periods and those sorts of things.
I was sort of half thinking that myself, but hoping someone was going to say something quite optimistic to perhaps, you know, bounce me out of it. But
so I think it's a case we'll have to wait and see. So I think at that point it might be a good point to wrap up the session, and it just leaves me to say thank you to all four of our speakers and for their presentations. Thanks to Katherine for the discussing remarks. I think it's been a really, really interesting discussion. And just to say thank you to everyone, and take care and goodbye.
Thank you.